Albania, 1908. In the stone city of Gjirokastër, Enver Hoxha is born one day to become the most feared and powerful ruler in his country's history. From partisan war and ruthless purges to a nation sealed behind bunkers and silence, this is the story of how Albania turned into a fortress state. What happened next and what it cost, you'll discover in this documentary narrative. Leave your comments, hit like, subscribe, and let's go! Enver Hoxha's story begins in a country that spent centuries learning the hard rules of survival and in a century that punished small states for every weakness. Albania, perched between mountains and the Adriatic, carried the memory of empire, invasion, and fragmented loyalties like a scar across generations. By the time Hoxha was born, independence was young and fragile, and the promise of a modern state still felt like a distant project. He came into the world on October 16, 1908, in Gjirokastër, a southern town built of steep streets and stone houses that clung to the hillside like a fortress. In such places, people measured each other by family name, reputation, and the ability to endure. A word spoken too freely could travel, and a family's standing could rise or collapse on rumor. The landscape itself trained caution. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also barriers, and the valleys could feel like corridors through which outsiders might return at any moment. Hoxha grew up with that permanent sense of exposure, the feeling that Albania's fate depended on how tightly it held itself together, and how quickly it could respond to danger. Even before he became a politician, the emotional climate of his childhood offered the raw materials of his later rule. Suspicion toward outsiders, insistence on discipline, and the belief that survival required control. His family belonged to the modest urban world where education mattered, where literacy could separate one life from another. Albania's social ladder was short, but education extended it. In the early decades of the 20th century, a teacher, a clerk, a person with foreign languages, carried the power of access. Hoxha took to school with seriousness and ambition. He learned to present certainty as strength, to speak with the tone of someone who corrects rather than negotiates. The teacher's voice would never leave him. It later became the voice of a ruler who demanded the entire nation repeat the lesson exactly as written. As a young man, he moved through schools that opened a window to the wider ideological currents sweeping Europe. The interwar period was a time when radical ideas competed like armies. Fascism promised order and national revival. Communism promised justice and the end of exploitation, and many young people believed history itself was about to tilt decisively toward one camp or the other. Hoxha's mind gravitated toward systems that offered total explanation. He was drawn to the idea that society could be engineered, that poverty and humiliation were not destiny, but the product of a structure that could be smashed and rebuilt. In that worldview, compromise was weakness, and politics was a struggle that ended only when one side eliminated the other. He spent time abroad and encountered circles where ideology was not a hobby but a commandment. In those environments, people learned to divide the world into friends and enemies with a single sentence. They learned that language itself was a weapon, that words could frame reality and decide who deserved sympathy and who deserved punishment. Hoxha absorbed that lesson deeply. Later, when he wrote and spoke as Albania's leader, he would speak as if the truth was not discovered but declared, as if historical laws were so obvious that disagreement could only come from bad faith. That manner of speech is one of the most important clues to his character. Hoxha did not merely want obedience, he wanted agreement. He did not merely want citizens who followed orders, he wanted citizens who repeated the worldview that justified the orders. And he wanted a system that could identify, isolate, and destroy those who could not be remade. The defining external shock came in April 1939, when fascist Italy invaded Albania. The invasion was not just military, it was psychological. It exposed how thin Albanian sovereignty still was, how easily a larger power could force a small country into submission. Occupation reshapes politics. It brings the question of legitimacy into every home. Who resists? Who collaborates? Who stays silent? Who benefits? It also offers militants the opportunity they crave, because it turns abstract ideology into action and gives underground organization the moral clarity of resistance. Albania's occupation generated competing movements. Nationalist groups fought for their vision of the country, and communist cells fought not only to expel the invader, but to build a different state afterward. In this environment, the struggle against the occupier was inseparable from the struggle over Albania's future. The group that could claim the mantle of liberation would claim the right to rule. The communist movement proved effective at building disciplined structures. It recruited youth, formed committees, developed clandestine communication, and cultivated a narrative of uncompromising resistance. Hoxha emerged as a political organizer within this growing machine. His rise was not the rise of a romantic rebel, it was the rise of a man who understood the power of organization and the value of presenting himself as the guardian of ideological purity. When Italy collapsed in 1943 and German forces moved into the region, the war intensified and the moral landscape darkened. Guerrilla conflict brutalizes society. Reprisals are common, betrayal becomes a daily fear, and violence becomes the language through which political messages are delivered. In such conditions, movements develop internal security mechanisms. They punish dissent, enforce discipline, and eliminate rivals under the banner of necessity. Hoxha learned that lesson with frightening efficiency. He learned that a movement must control not only its enemies but its friends, because friends who think independently can become rivals later. He learned that a leader who controls the apparatus of judgment controls the future. By late 1944, communist-led partisans were the dominant force inside Albania. The end of the war did not bring an open contest among political parties in the way some might imagine. It brought a rapid consolidation in which the communist leadership moved to monopolize power. Post-war communist revolutions often follow a pattern. The party claims legitimacy through liberation, then moves swiftly to eliminate alternative centers of influence. It takes over ministries, police forces, courts, education, and media, and it rewrites laws so that opposition becomes illegal by definition. This is not simply the seizure of government, it is the reconstruction of society so that the state and the party become inseparable. Under Hoxha, Albania went through this transformation quickly. The old elites, the landowners, the merchants, the former officials, and influential figures with independent authority were targeted. Property was confiscated, institutions were restructured, and the economy began to be shaped by state ownership and planning. These acts were presented as social justice and modernization, and to many poor Albanians they did offer a form of upward mobility through new schools and new careers. But they also served the deeper political purpose of breaking any social class that could stand outside the party's control. The most critical instrument was the security apparatus. In a system like Hoxha's, the secret police are not a side feature, they are the spine. They monitor, recruit informants, investigate, arrest, interrogate, and build a climate where citizens learn to weigh each sentence before speaking. The point is not only to punish opposition, but to prevent opposition from forming. When people believe they are watched, they watch themselves. When they fear that a neighbor, colleague, or relative might report them, they censor their own thoughts in public. Over time, this creates a culture of performance in which loyalty is acted out daily and private truth retreats into silence. Hoxha's Albania would become one of the most intense examples of this phenomenon in Europe. In the earliest post-war years, Albania was closely tied to Yugoslavia under Josip Broz Tito. The relationship made strategic sense. Albania was impoverished and had limited infrastructure. Yugoslavia was larger and influential, with regional ambitions and the ability to provide support. Yugoslav advisors played roles in Albanian development, and there were pressures that hinted at deep integration, perhaps even absorption, under a broader Yugoslav framework. For Hoxha, this created an immediate dilemma. He needed backing, but he feared domination. This tension between seeking protection and resisting control became a repeated pattern throughout his rule. He would align with a larger communist power, accept aid, and then, once he felt threatened or ideologically challenged, break away with fury, framing the rupture as a moral victory. In doing so, he could transform dependence into the narrative of heroic independence. The decisive break came with the Tito-Stalin split in 1948. When Stalin condemned Tito and Yugoslavia was expelled from the Soviet-led communist camp, Albania had to choose a side. Hoxha chose Stalin. It was a moment of strategic brilliance for him, because it allowed him to present himself as the defender of orthodoxy and to use the external ideological conflict as a weapon against internal rivals. In revolutionary systems, foreign policy splits become domestic purges. Those associated with the losing camp become enemies within, accused of betrayal and conspiracy. Hoxha's regime pursued such purges with ruthless speed. One of the most prominent victims was Koizaks, a powerful figure associated with Yugoslav influence, who was eventually arrested, tried, and executed. The message was clear. Loyalty was not merely political, it was life and death. From that point forward, The party leadership around Hoxha would be shaped by fear as much as conviction. Anyone could fall. Everyone could be accused. The leader became the only secure point in a system built on insecurity. Choosing Stalin tied Albania more tightly to the Soviet Union. Soviet aid, advisors, and models shaped Albanian institutions. The state pursued Stalinist industrialization and collectivization, and it promoted a political culture where ideology was treated as scientific truth. Literacy campaigns expanded, schools multiplied, and for many rural Albanians the socialist state brought roads, clinics, and new educational opportunities. These achievements were real and became part of the regime's narrative of progress. But modernization came with coercion. Collectivization restructured rural life, pushing peasants into collective farms and destroying traditional property patterns. Central planning imposed targets and bureaucratic methods that often ignored local reality. The economy built heavy industry in a country with limited resources, and scarcity became an everyday feature of life. The regime responded to scarcity not by loosening control, but by moralizing it. Hardship was presented as virtue. Sacrifice proved loyalty. People were taught that shortages were the price of independence and ideological purity, and that complaining was an act of selfishness or betrayal. This Stalinist system might have softened after Stalin's death in 1953, as many Eastern Bloc regimes cautiously shifted. But in Albania, it hardened. When Nikita Khrushchev began de-Stalinization and criticized Stalin's crimes, Hoxha saw not a reform but a threat to the foundation of his authority. His legitimacy depended on the claim that the party had always been right, that harsh measures were necessary, and that ideology justified the structure of power. If Stalin could be condemned, then the terror and purges associated with Stalinism could be questioned, and questioning was the beginning of revolt. Hoxha refused the new Soviet line. He denounced de-Stalinization as revisionism, portraying it as betrayal of Marxism-Leninism and the first step toward capitalist restoration. In his speeches and writings, he framed ideological compromise as corruption, and he treated the Soviet shift as proof that even great socialist powers could fall into treason if they weakened discipline. This stance pushed Albania toward confrontation with Moscow and toward an unusual alliance with Maoist China. The Sino-Soviet split created an opening. China, seeking allies against Soviet influence, supported Albania economically and politically, and Albania became China's most vocal supporter in Europe. For Hoxha, the Chinese alliance offered a lifeline and a stage. It gave him resources after Soviet aid declined, and it allowed him to claim that Albania stood at the forefront of pure socialism, while others betrayed it. Yet the alliance also deepened the siege mentality. Under Hoxha, Albania's relationship to the outside world became increasingly defensive. Western culture, foreign contacts, and even the influence of neighboring socialist states were treated as contamination. Travel became tightly controlled. Foreign broadcasts were discouraged or punished. The regime tried to seal the nation culturally as well as politically. Hoxha's most radical attempt to seal Albania came through his assault on religion. Albania had long been religiously diverse, with Muslim, Orthodox, and Catholic communities. In many parts of the Balkans, religion functions not only as belief but as identity, as ritual, as family memory, as the social fabric itself. Hoxha treated religion as a rival power. It offered moral authority independent of the party and connected Albanians to wider worlds beyond the state's control. In the 1960s, the regime intensified campaigns against religious institutions, culminating in the declaration of Albania as an atheist state and the banning of public religious practice. Churches and mosques were closed or repurposed. Clergy were persecuted, imprisoned, or silenced. The message was not subtle. The party would replace every competing source of meaning. The state attempted to redesign rituals of life, marriage, mourning, celebration into secular, socialist forms. It tried to replace faith with ideology, prayer with slogans, spiritual authority with political authority. For many citizens, this was a deep rupture. Some conformed publicly while preserving private belief in whispers. Others, especially the young raised under the new order, grew up without visible religious tradition at all. The loss was cultural as well as spiritual, and it demonstrated the regime's ambition to reshape the inner landscape of society. The system's reach extended into culture and education with equal intensity. Schools taught political doctrine alongside literacy and mathematics. History was written as a story of class struggle and liberation culminating in the party's victory. Art and literature were forced into ideological service. Writers, filmmakers, and artists were expected to produce work that glorified socialist labor, partisan heroism, and the party's moral clarity. Styles associated with Western modernism or individualism could be condemned as decadent. Cultural life became a field of surveillance. A poem could be political evidence. A song could be ideological deviation. The state trained citizens not only to obey but to interpret, to search for hidden meanings, to suspect that the wrong taste or the wrong joke could reveal a hostile mind. Within the ruling elite, Hoxha maintained power through a mixture of ideological authority and fear. He did not present himself merely as a strong man, he presented himself as the embodiment of correctness. Correctness is a special kind of power in a one-party system because it turns disagreement into moral failure and treason. Hoxha wrote extensively, producing ideological works that served as both doctrine and self-justification. These texts shaped how cadres spoke, giving them a rigid vocabulary of purity and betrayal. In such a climate, officials competed to prove loyalty. The safest position was often to be more orthodox than everyone else, to denounce more fiercely, to display zeal. This created spirals of extremism in which moderation itself could be interpreted as doubt, and doubt could be interpreted as sabotage. Purges remained an essential mechanism. They were not only instruments to eliminate rivals, they were rituals that refreshed fear. Prominent officials could fall suddenly, accused of conspiracies, foreign ties, or ideological deviation. The charges were often dramatic and absolute, leaving no room for partial guilt. Trials could be staged to display confession and condemnation. Sentences could include execution, long imprisonment, forced labor, and the punishment of families through stigma and exclusion. The effect was to keep the elite unstable and dependent on the leader, and to signal to society that the state's gaze reached everywhere. Meanwhile, daily life was shaped by austerity and by the moral discipline of scarcity. Albania's planned economy emphasized heavy industry and collectivized agriculture, and the state celebrated the building of factories, dams, mines, and rail lines as proof of socialist progress. Literacy improved, healthcare expanded, and the regime offered a narrative of upward mobility. A peasant child could become an engineer or a party official through education and ideological commitment. Yet the economy struggled to provide consumer variety and comfort. People queued for goods. Clothing and household items were limited. Housing could be cramped. The state framed such hardship as noble. Citizens were told that they were living the truth of socialism, not the temptations of consumerism. Complaints could be condemned as selfishness, as political weakness, as evidence of bourgeois mentality. In this way, economics became politics and politics became morality. Hoxha's siege mentality eventually reshaped the physical landscape of Albania through the mass construction of bunkers. Thousands upon thousands of small concrete domes and fortifications were built across the country on hills, in fields, near beaches, beside roads, turning the land into a map of paranoia. The rationale was defense against invasion. Hoxha believed enemies surrounded Albania: capitalist powers, revisionist communists, hostile neighbors, internal traitors. The bunkers were a military policy and a psychological message. They reminded citizens daily that danger was permanent, that vigilance was identity, and that the regime's harshness was justified by existential threat. The bunkers also consumed resources that could have improved housing or consumer life, but in a siege worldview, comfort is a risk and sacrifice is proof. The state trained people to see hardship as security. The closer Albania aligned with China, the more it framed itself as a lone fortress of true socialism. Yet alliances in the communist world were rarely stable. Ideological shifts, geopolitical pressures, and changing leaderships altered the landscape. Over time, China's strategic posture evolved, and Hoxha watched with suspicion. He treated deviation as betrayal, and betrayal as an attack on Albania's survival. Eventually, Albania's alliance with China collapsed as well, leaving the country with almost no major external partner. The final break deepened Albania's isolation and intensified the doctrine of self-reliance. Hoxha insisted that Albania would stand on its own feet, and he turned isolation into pride. He preferred a sealed country to one exposed to influence, because influence threatened ideological purity, and ideological purity was the glue that held his system together. In this closed environment, people learned to live double lives. Public speech became careful, filled with approved phrases and safe enthusiasm. Private life became the space where doubt could exist, but even private life could be dangerous, because informants could be anywhere, and because fear could enter the family itself. Children learned what could be said at school and what could be said at home. Adults learned what could be said in the workplace and what could be said only with trusted friends. A society like that does not simply silence opposition, it reshapes relationships. Trust becomes selective. Friendship becomes cautious. Humor becomes coded. Many citizens adapted not because they believed every doctrine, but because survival required it. And yet within those constraints, human life persisted. Love, care, ambition, quiet dreams, secret music, whispered memories of a wider world. Hoxha's later years were dominated by the need to preserve the system without weakening it. Authoritarian systems fear succession because the transfer of power can unleash rivalries and expose the system's fragility. Hoxha maintained ideological control and kept the elite under pressure, ensuring that no alternative center of authority could stabilize. The regime continued to monitor society, punish dissent, and enforce conformity. Albania remained isolated even as other socialist states experimented with limited reforms and greater contact with the West. Hoxha believed that opening would invite corruption and collapse. In his mind, cracks were fatal. He kept the jar sealed even when the air inside grew stale, because staleness seemed safer than contamination. He died in 1985, leaving behind not only institutions but habits. Habits of silence, caution, performance, and fear. The system did not disappear overnight with his death, but without the architect, contradictions grew harder to manage. Albania would soon face the pressures of a changing world and the broader collapse of communist regimes in Europe. When transition finally came, it would be painful and chaotic, made harder by the fact that civil society had been suppressed and pluralism prevented from developing. Hoxha's legacy would remain contested. Modernization achievements weighed against repression, sovereignty weighed against isolation, literacy and infrastructure weighed against purges, surveillance, and cultural suffocation. But beyond debates over statistics and policies lies the deeper imprint. A national psychology shaped by permanent siege, where the state trained citizens to equate safety with obedience and to treat independent thought as danger. Hoxha promised liberation and built a system that made freedom itself feel risky. He claimed to defend Albania's independence, and in a narrow geopolitical sense he refused domination by any single foreign power, breaking with Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and China rather than accept subordination. Yet he defended independence by tightening control until the country's inner life was constrained, and by turning isolation into identity. The bunkers became the symbol of that choice, scattered across the landscape like punctuation marks in a sentence that repeated endlessly. The world is hostile, the enemy is everywhere, the state is your only shield, and obedience is survival. This is the first half of the story, the construction of the fortress and the logic that made it possible. The next stage is what happens when a fortress becomes a cage, when the leader turns inward even against his own comrades, when the inner circle becomes the battlefield. And when the regime's greatest fear is no longer invasion but the possibility that the truth, once spoken openly, would be impossible to contain. In that cage, the state's logic began to feed on itself, because a system built on suspicion must constantly prove that suspicion is justified. And a system that proves it by finding enemies must keep finding enemies even when the most dangerous enemies are gone. Hoxha's Albania entered a period in which control was no longer simply a tool to defend the revolution, it became the revolution's meaning, the daily proof that the party still existed. The people were told that vigilance was patriotism and that relaxation was the first step toward defeat. Every external change could be framed as a plot, and every internal problem could be blamed on sabotage. If a harvest was poor, if a factory missed targets, if a shipment failed, there was always a convenient explanation that did not threaten the sacred story. Hostile elements were at work, foreign intelligence was infiltrating, ideological weakness was spreading, discipline had slipped. In such a system, reality is not something to learn from, it is something to accuse. Hoxha refined this method until it became the rhythm of the state. The party did not merely govern, it educated, condemned, corrected, and purified. It treated society as a classroom and a battlefield at the same time, and it demanded that every citizen be both student and soldier. The 1960s, especially, were years when Hoxha pushed the idea that Albania must be remade down to its deepest habits. The ban on religion, the tightening of cultural policy, the militarization of public life, and the intensification of ideological training were not isolated decisions, they were part of a single impulse to remove every competing source of loyalty and meaning. The regime wanted a citizen who had no refuge outside the party's narrative. If faith was a refuge, it had to be broken. If traditional authority was a refuge, it had to be humiliated. If foreign music or foreign fashion provided an alternative emotional world, it had to be condemned as poison. If a private joke could undermine the sacred seriousness of the system, it had to be treated as an attack. And so Albania entered an era in which even the smallest signals of independence could be interpreted as ideological deviation. This is how total control becomes a kind of hunger. The state becomes obsessed not only with what people do, but with what they admire, what they read, what they desire, what they remember, and what they dream. Under Hoxha, the line between political crime and personal difference blurred until difference itself felt dangerous. The Sigurimi, the security apparatus, served as the regime's instrument of penetration. It built files, recruited informants, and cultivated fear as an everyday condition. People learned to speak in a way that sounded correct even when it meant nothing. They learned to praise in public and to weigh silence carefully. They learned to interpret official language as a coded form of power. A praise could be a warning, a criticism could be a death sentence, and a rumor could destroy a career. The Sigurimis' influence did not require constant arrests to be effective, it required uncertainty. If you do not know who is listening, you assume someone is. If you cannot predict what the state will punish, you avoid risk entirely. This is how a society learns to police itself. It is also how an authoritarian regime achieves something deeper than obedience. It achieves a kind of inner caution that remains even when the police are not visible. Hoxha understood this. He understood that fear works best when it becomes habit. At the same time, the leadership pushed enormous energy into building the image of a righteous nation under siege. Albania's media and education repeated the story. Enemies surrounded the country, traitors lurked within, and only the party's firmness prevented national extinction. In this narrative, Albania did not merely exist, it endured heroically. It did not merely lack goods, it sacrificed. It did not merely restrict travel, it protected itself. It did not merely censor, it purified. For those who accepted this story, Hoxha's system could feel like a moral mission. For those who doubted it, the story was still useful as camouflage, because repeating it publicly was a form of protection. Thus the regime created a population trained in performance, and performance became a second language. It was spoken in factories and offices, in schools and meetings, in newspapers and public celebrations. It was spoken even by people who no longer believed. This is a key feature of long-lived dictatorships. They do not rely only on belief, they rely on the fact that public disbelief is too dangerous to express, and private disbelief is too fragmented to become a force. Hoxha's Albania remained austere, and austerity became a political tool. Shortages and limited consumer life made citizens dependent on the state for access to work, education, housing, and opportunity. The party could reward loyalty with advancement and punish suspicion with stagnation. Careers depended on political reputation. A family's history could matter. A relative's past could follow you into the future. Children learned early that the safest path was to be correct. The regime created a moral world in which correctness had a practical value, and that value shaped choices across generations. And while the state promoted literacy, technical skills, and industrialization, it also discouraged precisely the kind of openness that might have made modernization sustainable. A small country needs trade, technology, and exchange. Albania limited these. Hoxha preferred slower development to exposure because exposure brought the possibility of comparison. Comparison is dangerous to a dictatorship because it reveals that hardship is not inevitable, that alternative systems exist, that the official story is not the only story. Isolation was therefore both a defense strategy and a narrative strategy. If the citizen never saw the outside world could be described in any way the regime wanted. It could be portrayed as decadent, cruel, collapsing, hungry for Albania's destruction. The less people knew, the easier it was to frighten them. Yet even in isolation, rumors seeped in. People heard fragments about foreign life, about music and fashion, about technology, about different kinds of freedom. They heard that other socialist states were changing, that the Soviet Union was not what it once was, that some countries were relaxing controls, that the world was moving. This created a silent tension. The state insisted history was on its side, but the feeling of stagnation was difficult to hide. In response, Hoxha doubled down. One of the most visible doublings was the bunkerization campaign, which turned paranoia into architecture. Bunkers were built in extraordinary numbers, transforming coastlines, fields, hills, and villages into a landscape of concrete eyes staring outward. The campaign was sold as national defense and as a symbol of readiness. Citizens were told that every bunker was a statement of sovereignty, that Albania would never be surprised, that every meter of land could become a battlefield of resistance. Yet the bunkers also symbolized something else. The regime's need to physically manifest its narrative. Concrete made fear feel real. It also allowed the leadership to claim action. If the world was threatening, then building bunkers proved that the party was protecting the people. But the people also knew what the bunkers cost. They consumed labor and materials that could have been used for housing, consumer goods, and infrastructure. The bunkers were a sacrifice demanded by an invisible war. They were the material proof of the siege mentality, and they helped anchor that mentality into the everyday view. You could not walk far in Albania without seeing the state's obsession with invasion. And if you saw it everywhere, you began to imagine that invasion must be possible, because otherwise why would it be there? This is how propaganda and architecture can reinforce each other, trapping a society in a loop between fear and evidence of fear. Foreign policy was another arena where Hoxha's need for purity and control played out. The alliance with China allowed Albania to survive after breaking with the Soviet Union, but it also reinforced the pattern of dependence and rupture. Hoxha embraced China as a revolutionary ally and used the partnership to condemn Soviet revisionism. Albania became a loud ideological voice, insisting that Marxism-Leninism was being betrayed elsewhere and preserved only in places willing to reject compromise. However, Hoxha's devotion was never blind. He watched his allies for signs of deviation, and as China's own strategy evolved, he grew increasingly hostile. The world was changing in ways that did not match his script. China moved toward pragmatic foreign relations. It adjusted its posture. Hoxha interpreted such adjustments as ideological decay. In his mind, a revolutionary state must never negotiate in ways that soften its doctrine. Doctrine was the identity of the regime, and identity was the armor of the nation. When he felt that China's line diverged from what he considered true Marxism-Leninism, he reacted as he always did, with denunciation, condemnation, and eventually rupture. The break with China pushed Albania into its most isolated phase. Without a major patron, the state had to rely even more on internal mobilization and the mythology of self-reliance. Hoxha turned the loss into another moral narrative. Albania did not lose an ally, it exposed an ally's betrayal. Albania did not become isolated, it became purer. The deeper consequence, however, was economic strain. Aid diminished. Trade options narrowed. Technology and investment were limited. The leadership compensated by demanding more sacrifice and tighter discipline. Hardship was not a temporary storm, it became the climate. In such climates, the regime cannot admit failure because admission would invite questions, and questions would invite the collapse of authority. Instead, the regime blames enemies, calls for vigilance, and intensifies control. This is how isolation becomes self-perpetuating. It creates problems, and then the problems are used to justify the isolation. Within the ruling apparatus, the atmosphere of suspicion deepened. Hoxha's style of rule required periodic purification because the system's greatest fear was betrayal from within. If external enemies were distant, internal enemies could be created. If the revolution had already destroyed the old elites, it could still destroy new elites accused of becoming corrupt, soft, or revisionist. The party's internal life became a landscape of careful loyalty. People around Hoxha learned to read his mood, his signals, the subtle shifts in rhetoric that could indicate who was rising and who was falling. In authoritarian systems, the leader's preferences become law before they are written. Officials learn to anticipate. Anticipation becomes survival. Hoxha's own writings and speeches were treated as sacred texts, and cadres were expected to learn them, cite them, and apply them. This created a kind of ideological bureaucracy in which language became a ritual. Yet language also became a trap, because the wrong emphasis could be interpreted as deviation. In such contexts, the elite becomes less innovative and more cautious. It becomes skilled at repeating doctrine and at avoiding responsibility. The leader, meanwhile, becomes increasingly isolated because truth becomes dangerous to deliver. Subordinates fear telling him what he does not want to hear. They filter reality. They report success, loyalty, and progress. This creates a distortion that can deepen the regime's paranoia, because when reality contradicts the reports, the leader assumes sabotage. Under Hoxha, the state's response to contradiction was often punishment rather than analysis. If production targets failed, someone must be guilty. If youth culture drifted, someone must be corrupting. If an official suggested moderation, he must be revisionist. The machine of accusation kept moving. One of the most dramatic expressions of this internal battle was the fate of prominent figures who had been close to the center of power. In regimes like Hoxha's, closeness is not protection, it can be danger, because those nearest the leader are the most plausible successors and the most feared rivals. When suspicion turns inward, the inner circle becomes the battlefield. Accusations of conspiracy, foreign ties, or ideological betrayal can be used to remove individuals who have become too influential or too independent. The effect is to warn the remaining elite that no one is safe, and to reinforce the leader's position as the only permanent authority. As time passed, Hoxha's system displayed an extreme form of this logic. It did not merely punish dissidents outside the party, it periodically devoured its own. This was not an accident. It was a method. By keeping the elite unstable, Hoxha prevented the formation of alternative power blocks. Yet the human cost was enormous, and the political cost was hidden. Competence was sacrificed to loyalty. Initiative was sacrificed to caution. The state could enforce obedience, but it struggled to generate creativity and economic dynamism. Meanwhile, the public lived with the consequences. In everyday Albania, the texture of life was defined by routine, scarcity, and political rituals. People worked in factories and fields under state plans. They attended meetings where political slogans were repeated. They sent children to schools where ideology was taught as certainty. They navigated a system where advancement depended on political reputation. Yet within the boundaries of public life, private life still existed. Families formed bonds, shared meals, told stories, and developed quiet strategies to endure. People learned how to obtain goods through networks of trust. They repaired old items rather than replace them. They used humor cautiously, sometimes in coded ways. They developed private worlds of music and memory, sometimes listening to forbidden broadcasts quietly, sometimes holding on to old songs, old prayers, old traditions that had no legal space. The regime tried to eliminate religion, but it could not entirely eliminate the human hunger for meaning beyond politics. It could punish outward practice, but it could not erase memory from every mind. Yet memory itself could be dangerous, because the regime framed the pre-communist past as backward and oppressive. The party claimed to be the beginning of real history, and it demanded that the citizen's identity begin there too. This created generational fractures. Older citizens remembered other worlds and learned to hide those memories. Younger citizens grew up in a closed environment where the regime's story was the only official story. They did not necessarily love it, but they were shaped by it. They learned caution as a natural instinct. They learned to separate what is said in public from what is felt in private. Even when such regimes fall, that separation can survive like a reflex. By the late years of Hoxha's rule, his health and age made succession a critical question. Succession in a dictatorship is always delicate because the leader must ensure continuity without allowing rivals to coalesce. Hoxha managed this by maintaining ideological control and by keeping the elite dependent. The system's stability relied on the party apparatus, the security structures, and the myth of siege, but it also relied on Hoxha's personal authority as the ultimate interpreter of doctrine. The more rigid the system, the more it needs a final judge, because rigidity creates constant opportunities for accusations. Someone must decide which accusation is true. That someone was Hoxha. His role as judge gave him immense power, but it also meant that the system's coherence was tied to his presence. When he died, the structures would remain, but the original source of doctrinal certainty would be gone. Hoxha died in 1985 after decades in power. The state did not collapse on the day he died. It continued because authoritarian systems build institutions that outlast individuals. But his death began a process in which the system's contradictions became harder to contain. Albania faced a world that was shifting. The broader communist sphere was under pressure. Economies were strained. Ideological legitimacy was weakening in many places. Albania's isolation, once presented as heroism, became a heavy burden. Yet even as the system weakened after Hoxha, the habits he had built remained. The fear remained. The caution remained. The lack of independent civic institutions remained. The suppression of pluralism remained. And when change finally came, it would not be a smooth reform, it would be a rupture that revealed how much had been frozen. Looking back, Hoxha's life is the story of a man who rose through war and revolution, and then ruled through a doctrine of permanent siege. He built a state that could mobilize and educate, that could raise literacy and construct industry, but that also imprisoned minds, punished difference, destroyed independent institutions, and treated openness as poison. He presented himself as the defender of sovereignty and the guardian of true socialism, and he maintained that claim by breaking with allies whenever they changed course. Each break increased Albania's isolation, and each increase in isolation strengthened the regime's narrative of heroism under threat. The system became a loop. Isolation produced hardship. Hardship was blamed on enemies. Enemies justified repression. Repression protected isolation. Hoxha's most visible monuments were not palaces but bunkers, not symbols of prosperity but symbols of fear. His most lasting institutions were not markets or civic organizations but surveillance networks and ideological schools. His most profound legacy was not only material poverty or infrastructure gaps, but a culture trained to be silent, a society trained to perform, and a national identity shaped by the belief that safety depends on closing doors. The tragedy is that the doors were closed not only to foreign influence but to internal possibility. Albania was taught that freedom was dangerous and that disagreement was treason. When the system finally loosened after Hoxha, the country faced the difficult task of learning what had been prohibited. Open speech, independent association, trust between citizens, and a politics not built on fear. Hoxha believed he had protected Albania from domination and corruption. In the narrow sense of refusing to be absorbed by a stronger neighbor or controlled by a superpower, he succeeded. But he paid for that success by turning the nation inward so completely that the state's protection became a form of captivity. His biography, therefore, is not only the biography of a dictator, it is the biography of a fortress mentality made into policy, and it leaves a question that echoes beyond his era. What does a country become when it spends decades preparing for invasions that never come, while the most damaging occupation is the occupation of its own inner life by fear? The deeper you look into Hoxha's Albania, the clearer it becomes that the system was not sustained by one single instrument, but by a whole ecology of control in which ideology, policing, economics, and public ritual supported each other like beams in a sealed bunker. The party did not merely punish, it defined what normal meant, and then forced citizens to perform that normality so consistently that performance became habit. A person learned not only what to say, but how to hold their face, how to speak in meetings, how to applaud at the correct moments, how to demonstrate enthusiasm without appearing too eager, how to be loyal without attracting the dangerous spotlight of envy. In the long years after the war, Albania became a country where the safest life was often a life without edges, without strong opinions, without visible ambition. Because ambition could be interpreted as disloyalty, and individuality could be interpreted as arrogance. Hoxha's state wanted citizens who were useful and obedient, educated but not independent, skilled but not questioning, productive but not proud, and above all predictable. Predictability is the dictator's preferred form of peace because it allows the system to allocate fear efficiently. When people behave predictably, the state can focus its violence on those who do not. Under Hoxha, those who did not fit could be reclassified as hostile elements, and once reclassified they could be removed with the cold logic of political hygiene. The ideological campaigns that swept Albania in waves were not only political actions, they were mass psychological events designed to synchronize the population. A campaign would begin with speeches and editorials, then spread into workplaces and schools, into committees and neighborhood meetings, into factories and collective farms. People would be required to discuss, criticize, confess, and pledge. The language was always moral. It was never "we need policy adjustments." It was "we must purge corruption, we must defeat foreign influence, we must strengthen discipline, we must expose enemies." This moral framing created a permanent state of emotional mobilization. It made it difficult for citizens to see politics as a practical negotiation over resources and priorities, because politics was presented as a battlefield between purity and betrayal. In that battlefield, neutrality was impossible. The citizen was forced to choose a side, and the only safe side was the one defined by the party. Over time, this created a social environment in which people did not merely fear arrest, they feared being morally stained, because stain could spread to relatives and children, and could follow a person for life. A single accusation could close doors quietly, without a trial, without a prison sentence, simply by making someone unreliable. In a closed system where the state dominates employment and education, unreliability is a form of exile while remaining at home. The Sigurimi's power was amplified by this moral structure. It did not need to be everywhere physically because it could be everywhere socially. The state encouraged citizens to watch each other, to interpret each other's behavior as evidence, to report suspicious words, suspicious tastes, suspicious connections. An unusual friendship, a distant relative abroad, an interest in foreign radio, an admiration for a band singer, a refusal to participate in a public ritual, any of it could be framed as ideological weakness. The regime's genius, if one can use that word for cruelty, was that it made people cooperate with their own surveillance. People reported not only out of loyalty but out of self-protection, because the worst position was to be seen as silent while someone else was accused. Silence could be interpreted as sympathy, and sympathy could be interpreted as complicity. The safest citizen was not the quiet citizen, but the citizen who spoke correctly when required, who denounced correctly when required, who showed that they were not only obedient but vigilant. The social result was a society trained to anticipate danger in words. Language itself became a minefield, and the citizen learned to walk with careful steps. Hoxha's approach to culture was similarly total. He wanted art that marched in rhythm with the party. He wanted literature that showed not complexity but correctness, not tragic ambiguity but heroic clarity. The protagonist of socialist art was supposed to be the worker, the partisan, the loyal cadre, the person who overcame private weakness in order to serve the collective. The enemy was supposed to be the kulak, the bourgeois, the revisionist, the saboteur, the agent of foreign influence. The purpose was to train emotion. People do not live only by slogans, they live by stories. Hoxha's system understood that if it could control stories, it could control the imagination, and if it could control the imagination, it could reduce the risk that citizens might imagine a different life. When art becomes propaganda, it becomes a cage for the mind, because it limits the range of feelings that can be publicly recognized. The citizen learns that certain emotions are safe and others are dangerous. Pride in the nation, pride in labor, gratitude to the party, hatred of enemies, these are safe. Doubt, nostalgia for a pre-party world, curiosity about foreign life, admiration for difference, these become suspect. Even sadness could become dangerous if it suggested that the system had failed. The state therefore preferred sadness with a clear enemy, not sadness with uncertain cause. In the countryside, collectivization and state planning reshaped the rhythms of life. Traditional village autonomy was narrowed. Agricultural work was organized through collective structures that were both economic and political. Meetings were part of labor. Ideological training was part of production. The promise was modernization, equality, and liberation from old feudal patterns, but the lived reality could be harsh. Quotas, limited incentives, bureaucratic oversight, and the constant pressure to meet targets that were sometimes unrealistic. When targets were missed, the regime's reflex was rarely to question the plan, it was to question the people. Why did you fail? Became who sabotaged? And who influenced you? Scarcity in the countryside had a particular cruelty because the countryside produced food. If those who produced food still struggled, the system's narrative became harder to sustain. The state responded by tightening control over distribution and by blaming hostile elements. Rural families learned the same double life strategy as urban families. Public correctness, private adaptation, quiet improvisation. Urban life, meanwhile, was shaped by state workplaces and the moral hierarchy of loyalty. Factories and offices were not only sites of labor, they were sites of political monitoring. A person's career depended on their political profile. Advancement could be a reward for enthusiasm, but enthusiasm could also attract suspicion if it appeared self-serving. The safest path was often to be reliably loyal without seeming ambitious, which created a culture where talent could be hidden and innovation could be avoided. Yet the state demanded modernization, demanded industrial output, demanded technical progress. This contradiction is common in rigid systems. They want the benefits of modernity without the openness that modernity tends to require. They want engineers who do not ask questions beyond their assignments. They want technicians who do not compare their conditions to foreign conditions. They want teachers who teach knowledge but not independent thinking. Hoxha's Albania expanded education and trained professionals, and many citizens gained skills and literacy that would have been difficult in earlier eras, but the intellectual environment remained closed. Knowledge was encouraged as long as it served the system. Curiosity beyond the system was treated as danger. The regime's war on religion was among the most profound transformations because it attacked identity at its roots. In many Albanian communities, religious practice had intertwined with family tradition, local culture, and seasonal rhythm. By criminalizing public worship and closing religious institutions, the state attempted to sever those threads and replace them with secular socialist rituals. The party organized ceremonies that mimicked the social function of religious rites. Collective celebrations, public vows, commemorations of martyrs, anniversaries of liberation. The intent was to make the party not only the government, but the moral universe. In such a universe, the party decides what is sacred. Hoxha's state treated the partisan struggle and the socialist construction as sacred narratives, and it demanded reverence for them. The effect was not only repression, but cultural displacement. Even those who were not deeply religious could feel that something ancient had been pushed underground, and pushing it underground created a silent resistance in memory. Some citizens adapted easily, either because they welcomed secular modernity or because they feared the state. Others carried private faith quietly, turning belief into a secret language within families. But secrecy itself altered the nature of belief. When a practice is forced into the shadows, it becomes less communal and more fragile. Over time, the regime's success at suppressing public religious life created a generation that experienced spirituality not as public belonging but as private rumor. As Albania's alliances changed, Hoxha's internal campaign shifted accordingly. The break with Yugoslavia had produced purges of alleged pro-Yugoslav elements. The break with the Soviet Union intensified the denunciation of revisionism. The alliance with China encouraged the regime to portray itself as part of a global struggle against Soviet betrayal, and it pushed the idea that ideological firmness was Albania's most precious asset. Yet each time the regime defined an external betrayal, it also created a reason to look inward for internal betrayal. If the Soviets could betray socialism, then Albanian cadres could too. If a foreign power could infiltrate, then infiltration might be happening in ministries, in the army, in factories. Suspicion expanded like gas, filling every room. The most sensitive institution in any authoritarian state is the armed forces. An army holds weapons and organized manpower, and therefore it holds potential power. Hoxha's regime treated the military with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride, because the narrative of permanent siege required a strong defense posture. Fear, because a strong army can become a political rival. The solution was political control. Ideological indoctrination within the military, monitoring by security services, and periodic purges to ensure that no independent command structure could consolidate. The bunker program itself can be understood as part of this logic. Bunkers decentralized defense and turned the whole population into potential combatants, reducing reliance on a professional military elite. A country filled with small fortifications and militia training is a country where defense is dispersed, and dispersed defense is less likely to produce a single independent military authority. In that sense, bunkers were not only about invasion, they were about control. This obsession with control extended to borders. Leaving the country was tightly restricted, and the border itself became a symbol of the regime's fear of contamination. In a closed society, the outside world is not simply foreign, it is dangerous because it offers comparison. A citizen who sees foreign life might return with questions. Questions are the beginning of disobedience. The state therefore tried to limit exposure. Foreign visitors were rare and monitored. Diplomatic contact was narrow. Even within the socialist camp, Albania's posture became increasingly isolated and critical. Hoxha's writings portrayed Albania as a lonely guardian of true doctrine surrounded by traitors and opportunists. This narrative fed national pride while also feeding national anxiety. Pride and anxiety can be combined into a powerful authoritarian fuel. Pride convinces citizens they are special, anxiety convinces them they are threatened. Together they convince them to accept harshness as protection. Over time, the regime's inner circle became more dangerous than its outer enemies, because the only people with access to power were those within the party's top layers. Hoxha's method of rule required that no one around him become too popular, too independent, or too connected. Prominent officials could rise and fall abruptly. The fall was often framed as moral collapse. Corruption, treason, espionage. The purpose was to destroy not only the person but the memory of their legitimacy, to teach the public that the party cleansed itself and that loyalty was to the leader and the doctrine, not to individual officials. This also taught the elite that personal relationships were risky. Friendships could become evidence. Alliances could become conspiracies. In such environments, people learned to isolate emotionally, to trust only cautiously, and to treat colleagues as potential threats. The leader becomes more isolated too, because isolation is the price of being feared. The more the leader punishes betrayal, the more subordinates hide information that might be interpreted as disloyal, and the more the leader relies on filtered reality, which increases paranoia. It is a closed loop. Control breeds isolation, isolation breeds suspicion, suspicion breeds more control. In the late phase of Hoxha's rule, one of the most dramatic examples of this inward-turning suspicion was the case of Mehmet Shehu, a powerful figure who had long stood near the center of the regime, widely regarded as Hoxha's right hand and potential successor. In a normal political system, such a relationship might produce stable succession planning. In Hoxha's system, it produced danger. A successor is a rival in waiting. A rival in waiting is a threat to a leader who has built authority on being the sole interpreter of truth. When Shehu died under mysterious circumstances, the official narrative quickly shifted toward denunciation, and the regime launched a campaign portraying him as a traitor and enemy. The details became part of the regime's internal mythology, proof that even the highest ranks could harbor betrayal. The aftermath was not only personal tragedy but political signal. It warned every cadre that proximity to power did not protect it exposed. It also reinforced the regime's favorite story. Enemies are everywhere, even among those who appear loyal, therefore vigilance must never end. This episode served to tighten control in the final years because it justified further monitoring and prevented any smooth consolidation of a successor bloc. The public, watching these dramas through controlled media, absorbed the lesson in silence. People understood that if powerful officials could be destroyed, ordinary citizens had no protection. They also understood that official truth could change overnight. Yesterday's hero could become today's traitor. This taught citizens not to invest emotionally in individual leaders other than Hoxha, because only Hoxha was permanent. It taught them to treat political narratives as unstable and dangerous, to adapt quickly, to avoid repeating yesterday's praise if it might become tomorrow's evidence of association. The result was a population skilled in cautious adjustment, a skill that later generations would carry into the post-Hoxha era. Yet even as fear ruled public life, the regime continued to pursue modernization projects because it needed achievements to sustain legitimacy. It invested in industry, infrastructure, and education, often celebrating new factories and dams as proof that the party delivered progress. The state cultivated pride in self-sufficiency, portraying Albania as capable of building without dependence. But the economic reality of isolation limited the variety of development. Technology gaps grew. Productivity struggled. Consumer life remained limited. A young person might be educated and still experience a life of scarcity. The state framed this as noble, but the emotional appeal of nobility can weaken when it lasts too long without visible improvement. As Hoxha aged, the world outside Albania changed in ways that undermined his narrative. The Cold War moved through phases of tension and tente. Other socialist states pursued varying degrees of reform. Information technology and media expanded globally. Even without direct access, Albanians sensed that the world was not standing still. The regime responded by insisting that Albania's stillness was virtue. Stillness meant firmness. Firmness meant survival. Survival meant victory. But the logic became harder to sell to a new generation that had never experienced the chaos of pre-war Albania or the dramatic moral clarity of anti-fascist resistance. For those who did not remember occupation, the regime's constant emergency could feel less like protection and more like exhaustion. The state could still punish, but punishment cannot create genuine enthusiasm forever. It can create obedience and silence, but it can also create emptiness. Hoxha's final years therefore carried a particular tension. The system remained rigid, but time itself was changing around it. In such moments, authoritarian leaders often either loosen control to adapt or tighten control to resist. Hoxha chose tightening. He believed that opening would allow ideological infection to spread and would lead to collapse. He believed that the party's survival depended on preventing cracks, and he treated cracks as betrayal. This worldview shaped not only policy but emotion. It produced a leader who saw danger in every compromise and saw strength in every refusal. It also produced a country that became increasingly sealed, increasingly cautious, increasingly dependent on ritual and fear. When Hoxha died in 1985, he left behind a structure designed for permanence. A one-party state, a security apparatus embedded in society, an economy shaped by planning, a cultural sphere shaped by censorship, and a national narrative shaped by siege. He also left behind habits. The habit of silence, the habit of performance, the habit of interpreting language as danger, the habit of treating politics as a space where truth could kill. These habits did not vanish with his death. They lingered because they had been taught for decades. A society does not unlearn fear quickly, because fear is not an idea, it is a reflex. After Hoxha, Albania's leadership would face pressures it could no longer fully contain. Economic strain, global change, and the weakening of communist legitimacy elsewhere would eventually push Albania toward transformation. But transformation in a country as sealed as Albania could not be smooth. The institutions of pluralism and civil society had been suppressed. Independent organizations had been prevented from forming. Open debate had been dangerous. When the system finally began to loosen, it would not reveal a well-practiced democratic culture waiting beneath, it would reveal a vacuum and a hunger, a people eager to speak yet uncertain how to organize. A society accustomed to avoiding politics suddenly forced to confront it openly. Hoxha's legacy therefore stretched beyond his own era. It lived in the landscape of bunkers and in the landscape of memory, in the education system that had trained correctness, in the families that had learned silence, in the elite that had learned fear, and in the nation's complicated relationship with the outside world. His life demonstrated how a leader can turn national vulnerability into a permanent ideology of siege, and how that ideology can justify a state that seeks to control not only actions, but inner life. He claimed to defend Albania from foreign domination, and he did prevent the country from becoming a subordinate province of any single power, breaking with Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and China rather than accept subordination. But the price of that independence was a prolonged captivity of the nation's internal freedom. He turned Albania into a fortress, and a fortress, when inhabited too long, becomes a cage. The tragedy of the cage is that even when the door finally opens, those inside have forgotten what it feels like to walk without fear, and they must learn again, step by step, how to live in a world that is not permanently at war with itself.